Okay, so hello, and as promised, I'm sending you this recording of the next lecture. Although I promised also that we will have two topics for this session, I decided to just go for one topic because the other topic, which should be the one before what I'm presenting now, is already something that we have um, discussed, no, because it's about a site inventory, and so it's about the attributes, and we've actually even gone into an exercise on site inventory in your assignment. So therefore, all that's left is for me to discuss about site analysis, which is the next step. Um, the difference between site inventory and site analysis is as follows. No? The site inventory produces map data on the existing condition of the site and its context. And we've already seen this diagram with the physical, biological, and cultural attributes. And then site analysis, on the other hand, assesses the site's opportunities and constraints or design determinants for a specific land use program. So you have the program, and then you have the existing condition. And then um, by considering these two, we come up with the site suitability. Um, we have to remember the differences between the three types of maps that we've been discussing so far. I mentioned to you about the base map, and then we also make maps for site inventory, and we also make map for site analysis. So what are the difference between the three? The base map only shows the physical feature, okay, of the map of the area, and then the site inventory shows the three attributes or three categories, no, of attributes. And then the site analysis shows the constraints and opportunities. Those are basically the differences between the three. One concept when we talk about site analysis is the site carrying capacity. So in economics, you should know about the theory of the point of diminishing return. So if there's a graph, the line goes up, but at a certain point, it has to go down. So um, normally it does not go all the way up to infinity. No? Why? Because there are so many constraints. So it means that, for example, if you've been making money doing this, and then you keep on doing that activity, but at some point, even if you continue doing that, you don't make money anymore. Okay, so maybe you've been producing a lot of cakes, for example, you're selling them food, and then you produce so much that there's no demand for it anymore. The demand is only for so much. So uh, the other food that you have been uh, making now goes to waste because there's no more people buying them. There's only at a certain point. So that is your point of diminishing return. So if you go beyond that, you'll be starting to losing business already. So you make sure that you don't go beyond that point. Okay. It's also the same with planning. Okay. The use of the land, you can only do so much because there are other constraints. And that's why you have to be very, very good in planning, so that we can minimize the impacts of site impacts or externalities imposed by economic and social costs on others. And we also mitigate environmental degradation. Okay, so we've been thinking so much of development, to the point that we cover all the area, the land with cement, and then so no water can now penetrate the ground and recharge the aquifer. So therefore, we started to lose water, and then it starts to flood, etc., etc. So there has to be a good balance. That's why we have the building code, all of these guidelines to maintain that balance. Refraining from developing in certain sensitive or unique areas can be justified from an environmental quality perspective and can be supported on economic grounds. Okay, so by not developing to the more than the maximum, okay, so it's okay because there is always that there's all it can be justified. No? There's the economic theory to justify that. So you should not worry about it. So it's like also building in your property. Um, Most of the time, the client would really like you to build uh, all the way towards the property, no, on all sides, even the front. Then we have to tell them the disadvantage of doing this because ultimately it will go back to them. For example, they would not have any ventilation, and then if they forced to open um, in a firewall, so the neighbor might complain, and besides, there will be the danger of fire going inside their house. There's no protection anymore, and so many things aside from the environmental factors. No? For residential subdivision design, for example, so it says here that the most efficient plan is often a rectangular grid layout that became popular in tract home subdivisions in the 1940s and 1950s. Typically, however, the most profitable plan is one that takes advantage of the natural features on the site that provides other interesting design features or focal point. Okay, so if the site, for example, is not flat and there's some parts which are a bit hilly, so you don't need to force rectangular grid. No? You can probably make the road navigate through the slope uh, in a meandering way instead of just straight, rather than you flatten everything on the side. And then if there's a river, for example, or water feature, you don't have to cover that um, with land so that you can use the land over the river. So this is an example of that. No? You have a specimen tree, something which might attract um, buyers, so you can retain that. No? You don't have to cut it down. Then if there's a river, of course, it's a constraint. So you don't have to build over that. So now you're going to question, I have a small developable area. I'm supposed to have this big developable area here. But you can always go up if you want. And even if you don't go up, you can always increase um, the price of your development to potential buyers because you're offering some interesting features like a view, uh, a water feature, a tree, etc., etc. Okay, so it's really a matter of looking for that right balance. So suitability analysis has three steps basically. First is to identify suitability criteria for each anticipated land use, and then to collect and map the relevant site attribute data, and finally identify and map the site locations with attribute values that meet the suitability criteria for the targeted land use. We're familiar with the first um, two steps because we do that when we were selecting the site. And then you might ask, is this the same program that we're doing to select the site? It's actually a more detailed program. You also need to have a more detailed program on each level. Okay, so the third step says identify and map the site locations with attribute values. Um, it actually means that so when you have your property, for example, in your design now, you have a land. You have to sort of identify which part of that land is the best. So you have to grade somehow or rate each of the parts, which you will see later on. But first, when we try to get data, we have to uh, think about these considerations. The first is what are the requirements, what are needed. uh, for permitting applications to public agencies, and then the relevance, the data, whether it is old or new, because if it's an old data, it may not be relevant anymore. Things have changed. There's a new fad or there's a new trend, and, and relate to the suitability criteria for proposed uses. No? And it's also like, uh, for example, your data might be about some so broad, like you're showing a general climate of the Philippines when you're talking about the you're analyzing only a small parcel of land. No? So it's not relevant. Why? Because what's more relevant is the microclimate. What is really happening within the site? No, you might have the amihan and habagat, but then when it comes to the site, because of the existence of buildings, so the wind flow are directed somewhere else, or you do not you end up with a wind shadow or even a sun shadow. No, we're expecting a lot of sun here at this time, but because there are tall buildings or tall trees or there's a mountain right in front, so you ended up in the shade all the time, which might be good, but at least it's not part of your expectations. And data reliability, so whether the data are accurate in location and attribute classifications. Okay. Um, and finally, data availability, whether it exists. We can think of a data probably that it is possible to gather, but has anyone gathered them, or can you gather that considering time and resources? In doing the analysis, we can do a single attribute analysis. Okay, single attribute analysis mean that um, you make maps, you make an analysis with only one attribute each time. Okay, you can have multiple analysis. Like right now, I can have like 5 analysis. For example, this one is about soil, this one is about water, that one is about climate. But for each map that I'm going to make, I only consider one attribute. Okay, so I'm not saying that I will only have one map for the whole project. No, it's not. No, for each of the maps that we're doing. Um, so the primary objective usually is to find location that meet one or more specified attribute conditions. Um, and sometimes this can be uh, that's right. Data partitioning means even with a single map, single base map, like the topographic map, we can have separate analysis, no, for each attributes, for each data that we need. We can have a data on elevation only based on the topographic map, um, or we can have a data on the or analysis on the slope only based on the same topographic map, or maybe the range when we talk about the aspects. Okay, aspect, by the way, is um, the orientation of the slope, whether it's to the cardinal locations like north, south, east, west. So if the face of the earth of the land is facing north, so it's colored some in one way. If it's facing northeast, so it has a different color, etc. So that's aspect. So with only the topographic map, we have 3 separate maps analysis, okay, in our analysis map. But then for each of those maps, we only consider one attribute. There's also one thing called spatial buffering, okay, or sometimes it's called proximity analysis. It's used to identify location within a specified distance of one or more reference feature. So this is a constraint because um, you you have to make sure that you are not inside a buffer or a setback. Well, it works like that, no setback. After identifying your setbacks, so you make sure that you don't build near. Otherwise, you'll have to follow some guidelines, like you have to use a firewall or something else. No? Buffering may be used to locate areas near natural resources requiring protection from development. So in the mountains, for example, there are parts of the land which should be protected or protected by the government, and we should not do any activity there. And they also have a buffer area. So there's a like so many meters, like 40 meters, for example, where there can be activities but limited to a certain degree, and then that is specified. Okay, before it actually ends with a more strict area where no activities can be done at all or cultural resources requiring protection from development. Okay, so you have a cultural, you have a building, an old building, and you're not supposed to build near it somehow. Okay, so there might be a regulation from the municipality that tells you to build not less than 10 meters from these structures or hazards posing significant risks to human life and property. Okay, so we're familiar with flooding. So in the river, especially if the whole property is like flat, so we expect that if the river, the water level rises, there will be flooding. So normally the government would have a no build zone, or there's even a buffer also from the law, where in urban area the 3 meters from the high tide point going away from the river on both sides, no, is unbuildable. But then if you look around all the rivers of Cebu, you see a lot of squatters. Okay, so and then it's a constant battle between the government and the squatters to remove these shanties. So I mentioned buffers. I also mentioned setbacks. So what's the difference? Basically, the buffer goes outside from the area. Okay. Um, if if you have a property like in your design, so the buffer is going out of that area. Okay. But that applies if your area has something to protect. But if not, then there's no buffer. Okay. Um, and the setback is going inside. So from your property line going in, you should not build. So that's the difference between the two. So we mentioned about single attribute analysis. So there's also the multiple attribute analysis. Okay, which means you may have different maps, but for each map, when you make an analysis, you don't consider only one attribute, but maybe two or more. In which case, we do an overlay analysis like this one. Um, the I think this is clear in terms of how it's um, shown here, illustrated here. What is done here is that your your map, or for example your site, if the you make a grid, for example in your the site of your plate, you make a grid of maybe 1 by 1 or 5 by 5 meters or 10 by 10. I don't know. No, it depends on how you want to grade it. And then for each square in the grid, you make a rating depending on the criteria that you make. For example, if one is the best and three is the worst, so you score it 1 to 3. So this area, for example, is nearest the road. It is noisiest. It is one. It is 3. So, or it could be the other way around, where one is the worst and 3 is the best. It really depends on you. Um, so this can be for one criteria, maybe about noise. Second criteria maybe about something else, and then something else. No? The idea is to, when these are merged, their scores also merge. So, for example, in this corner here, which is highlighted, so the scores are 1, 3, and 3. Therefore, when In the composite grid, when everything is combined, so the score is now 7. Okay, so this is one way of scoring. There are other ways. One is called the union, and the other is intersection. So in the union, you add all the scores. Well, you include at least all uh, the numbers. So each unique number in the two original sets as follows. There are only two sets. So there's 1 and 3. So you put 1, 2, 3. Okay, because there's 2 and 3. In the union, you only select the number which is common to both. If this one has a score of 1 and 3, and the other one has a score of 2 and 3, so the common denominator is 3, or the common number is 3. So that's what you put in the composite. So there are many ways. So since we're talking about integration, um, we'll have to talk about site constraints and site opportunities. So one of the site constraints is of course difficult sites. Okay, we have a term here called physiographic. This actually refers to landform present in an area. So it's basically similar to geomorphology. So depending on the desired use of the site, physiographic constraints can affect the project's social and environmental impacts, its functional or land use feasibility, in addition to the cost for construction, maintenance, and operation. For example, building in difficult location requires comparatively more time and money before, during, and after construction. So what are difficult sites? So these are sites which are very steep, maybe very muddy, full of rocks. So anything that can prove to be very difficult when it comes to fulfilling our objectives for that site. Okay. Therefore, we try to avoid difficult sites. And then if we can't, so we have to somehow find a solution to be able to still uh, build our structure. No? So consequently, the development of sites with significant physiographic constraints may be economically and politically unfeasible. So as much as possible, we do avoid them. So in urban environments, microclimate can vary dramatically over short distances. Exploiting these mild microclimate or consciously creating them provides valuable opportunities for meaningful outdoor open spaces. Yet relatively harsh and uncomfortable microclimates also exist in urban areas. Now, there's a phrase here that I wanted to emphasize, although it's not really um, part of the topic now, but in the general way, it's actually related. It says creating them provides valuable opportunities. Creating microclimates, we can actually create microclimates. For example, if it's very windy in general, but the moment that it goes into our property, we can control the wind. Okay, the direction of the wind, the velocity of the wind, or even the heat from the sun, we can control it. Okay, so it's going to be very hot, so we put up we provide trees, or we provide overhangs to make it um, not so glaring, and then we provide a fan to cool down the heat so that it's now cooler. So it's like we build an oasis in a desert. So it's possible with I think we have a tropical design subject, no, in this curriculum. So these are things that are discussed in that course. Another constraint is natural hazards. So um, most of the time this is weather related, but there are also those which are not weather related, like earthquakes. No? Um, so the recurring nature of these events suggests, however, that it's not a question of if, but when a specific event will occur. Okay. Sometimes there's no way there. It's not possible to really vacate a land, a piece of land, not to develop it just because there might be earthquake. Okay, because generally everything is affected by an earthquake. But you can identify the fault where it is, and then you avoid that. But even if you relocate somewhere farther, there will still be shaking. So the idea is, how do you design so that your structure can still stand, no, even after the shaking, or even after a typhoon hits? Okay, because like the Philippines has like more than 20 typhoons every year, but that affects the whole area, no? So that doesn't mean that you cannot build in the whole of the zone if there's always typhoon every year, so 29 times. So you just have to develop the area so that even when the typhoon comes, so everyone is protected, there is very minimal damage. Um, in Vietnam, for example, the Mekong Delta, the river, Mekong River, it floods seasonally. Okay, so people have started to find a lifestyle where they expect the flood to come and it benefits them. And so that when the government was trying to solve the flooding problem, a lot of people were actually against it, that it will not flood anymore. So it's very funny, because they actually adapted already to the natural hazard. So that, for example, their houses are now on stilts, so that if it floods, so it's no problem because they already know the level at what level the flood will go, and then they go around with the bangka if ever it floods, or they can go by foot if the river is normal, something like that. So the least costly public policy option for managing this risk is to discourage development and redevelopment in high risk areas. Okay, so there will be no, I mean the all the LGUs are mandated to have hazard maps. Okay, um, so for example, if you're designing somewhere, you can go to the even to the level of the barangay. You can go to the barangay and then ask for the hazard map. So you will know that are we in a floodplain? Are we in a flood prone area? Are we in a landslide prone area? So you can easily um, make this analysis. There are also legal and cultural constraints. So it says here that the search for order and pattern should be part of the inventory and analysis process. So order and pattern. Okay. Within an urban context, patterns of mass and space and the relationships between these basic urban building blocks can be assessed in part with figure ground diagram. What is a figure ground diagram? So it's the map with the buildings, but then the buildings are all blackened and the open spaces, including the roads, are just white. Or it can be vice versa. The buildings are all white and everything else is black. And from that, we can see how much open space we have, whether it's the area is already very dense. Um, and also, we can have an idea of, for example, wind flow. Um, how the wind would probably flow around the all of these buildings. No? If we are talking about big developments like skyscrapers, uh, a wind flow analysis is really very important. Okay, so you need to make a model and then you have to subject it to a wind tunnel test involving a wind tunnel, and then you have to measure the wind expected in proportion to, of course, the scale model and all of that stuff. No? The assessment of context involves identifying neighborhood and community spaces and determining what activities and symbolic values associated with those spaces. So I think the keyword here are symbolic values, okay? Um, because there are times when an activity or a place might be so simple looking, but people put a lot of value in them. Okay, the spatial and temporal qualities of place are particularly relevant to urban infill projects. Okay, because infill projects mean you're just trying to insert yourself. No, you're not trying to develop the whole urban area. So your project can be an infill project. So the property is only a vacant lot in amidst so many other buildings at the sides. And so those other buildings at the sides already have a character of their own. People already have like a way of life. And so you being the only insert there in the gap has to consider all of the uh, all of this, you know, information. These are some of the examples of analysis that can be done considering these constraints in legal and cultural. No? You can do an analysis of pedestrian circulation. What you will look for probably is whether there's a lack of walkway connectivity, there's inadequate capacity, your roads are very small, then there's so many cars or people using it, conflicts among vehicle, bicycles, and pedestrians, whether they all cross the same path and it's making it difficult or unsafe, and lack of seating and other side furniture. In Japan, for example, I was complaining there that after walking so much, I could not find a bench where I can sit, or if I do find a bench, it's actually meant for customers who are waiting in line. So that if you sit there, the owner would go out and ask you to come in because there's a seat already available inside. No? So it's very embarrassing. But then that's one way for them to actually control also the people who are idle. They don't want people to be hanging around because sometimes some people are not very polite, no? If they just hang around and then call on other people passing by. Another is an analysis of site architectural context. You would identify large and articulated building facades covered with visually monotonous materials, unbroken roof lines, and all others. You can also do analysis of urban streetscapes. And just read the text here. No? So you have constraints, and so you also have opportunities. So it says here that significant site amenities have social, economic, ecological, and aesthetic value. So these physical assets, if integrated within a development plan, can preserve a site's sense of place and enhance quality of life for future site users. So there's always an advantage also, no? On some properties. It's not always constraints. Site opportunities include locations on the site that are potentially usable for one or more project objectives, whether they entail real estate development or like the construction of buildings, roads, and other facilities, or it has environmental conservation or restoration to provide an on-site natural amenity, or a combination of these purposes. Okay. Um, One opportunity that can arise is what we call, or that we can identify, is the sense of place. Okay. I mentioned earlier about the constraints. So legal and cultural constraints. No, that in an infill development, you have to deal with all of these uh, existing cultures, existing way of life, existing um, orientation. For example, people have always oriented their uh, their what themselves, no, in terms of wayfinding on this landmark. So you cannot just remove that landmark, otherwise people get disoriented and then get lost, no, or things like that. But aside from being a constraint, they can also be an opportunity If you, for example, adapt that, so people easily accept your development and would even consider it as their own, okay, and then would even protect your development because it is part of their own. So it's like you're now ano, you're part of their own development. So it says older architecturally significant buildings are very important cultural components, yet sense of place is also fundamentally influenced by the native landforms and vegetation and other tangible and intangible elements within the built environment. So people are here because, for example, if there is a rice paddy or there's a river, so people are here because they are um, farming or there are fishermen. Okay, so that if you cut off the river from the people because you're going to build a resort or something else, and then you don't want them to enter anymore, so you're actually uh, they're actually introducing a conflict, no? So you should be able to still provide for their way of living. Otherwise, so the people will reject your development and be hostile to you. So new development that does not respond to local site conditions, including surrounding context, contributes to placelessness. Okay, what is placelessness? Placelessness occurs when buildings are constructed and sites are developed in ways that are not adapted to the site's historical and environmental context. It also results from a lack of attention to space making. Okay? Too often, little or no attention is given to the creation of outdoor open space, their spatial organization and connectivity, or to their furnishing and refinement. So, um, space making is like place making also. Okay, you want placemaking is like when you introduce an activity in a place for a lot of people so that they consider that as their own, so that they congregate. Okay, because otherwise, if there's no people, the place will be uh, really sad, no? Unless, of course, you're building a monument or memorial, you don't really want people to be hanging around. But when you're designing a plaza or something like a mall, and then you're supposed to have open space, you expect a lot of people to go there. But sometimes even that is a failure depending on how you design it. One case in point, which you can probably Google, is the Boston City Hall. Okay, you read about it. It's a brutalistic architecture, but then they provided a very big plaza in front, and yet no one actually makes use of the plaza. No? So it died. I saw I read an article about what we call space syntax, where you can actually analyze the number of people passing through certain streets or pathways, and then you can analyze the place. Now, in this case, there is a this one is in Britain or UK, but I forgot the place. And then there's a very big building, and right in front of it is like a pathway with stairs going to both sides. And then right in front of it, at the lower level, of course, is now a plaza. But then they noticed that in the whole plaza, there's this space just right below that that place, no, that platform where no people go, and then or if some people go, they consider it like a private place, so that's where they urinate. And then anyway, it's starting to the government wanted to make good use of that place, so they asked this architect um, to uh, provide solutions. So they did this spacing tax and then analysis, and then they found out that the reason why people don't go there is that it is really out of the way of everyone. Okay, so people don't bother to go there anyway because it's like a dead end. And so what they're proposing is that provide a stair right in the middle, not only going to the side but going down to that. And then when they did, so that became a very busy place. Okay, so no one would urinate there anymore because there's a lot of people. So that's one way, of analyzing. Cultural significance is also a big opportunity, in a site. Analysis of the built environment, examine how and why people use or avoid outdoor spaces. So we mentioned that earlier. And post-occupancy evaluation of outdoor spaces is particularly useful for urban sites. Natural as well as built features give neighborhoods unique identities. So specifically, character is derived from the following attributes. So the location, so it depends on the neighborhood, whether uh, there is a strong bond among the neighborhood. No? The scale, whether it is very big or very small, or whether it's so temporary, because a place where people know that they can only live there for a few months, and normally they don't take good care of the place because anyway they're living mixed users and their connection. So it can be uncomfortable to have only a place where you have all Tagalogs or you only have Bisaya. So there should be a good mixture. And not only that, no, you only have Filipinos, no foreigners. So it's not as interesting. So time, sites change diurnally, seasonally, and other generation movements, transportation. So um, all of this has a lot. They have a lot of opportunities to offer in the site. An important objective of the site analysis is to discover the special, interesting, and valuable features of the site and its context. So these assets range from unique natural areas to culturally significant local places that to someone unfamiliar with the neighborhood or community may be overlooked. So it's important that you become familiar with your own site, project site. That familiarity that go down to the local level, the same familiarity as they are. No? So you do not you become one of them, not an outsider. Um, if, of course, if you cannot do an immersion like that, so you will have to just be understanding and probing, always asking people. Okay, so what are the things here that you should be aware of? And normally people will share because if they, especially if they're proud of their own place, they will tell you the latest thing um, of their place, and then they can even tell you about some people, interesting people. Although they may not have any impact on the development, but there might be some which can give you an idea of how to uh, about your development. No? They might mention some feature of the site where people would normally gravitate to. A lot of kids are attracted, or they might hear about complaints. They can tell you about complaints and anything. So these are what you do in the analysis. Okay. So our next topic would be about, I think when we make schematics already, um, we go into site development. Okay. Um, we'll show the next step, which is okay, what to do with all this analysis that we discussed about. So basically, that's the topic for today. Um, I hope to see you on Tuesday next week for a synchronous meeting. Okay, so goodbye for now.